How do we know we got the right books in the Bible? How many variants are there in some of the early New Testament copies we have in Greek? And do they undermine our confidence in the text? Bottom line, how do we know we can trust the Bible? This is the issue we're going to get in today. I've got two guests I'm thrilled to have on because they've written a recent book together called Scribes and Scriptures. And those of you watching this know that I've done some work in this area on a popular level with the book Evidence That Demands Verdict. And even reading this book, I learned some new insights. So I'm confident you will as well. My first guest I welcome back to the show. Peter Gurry is a New Testament scholar. John Meade, for the first time, who did his PhD at Southern Baptist like I did as well, but a scholar in the Old Testament. Fellas, thanks for writing a great book, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us on, Sean.
Well, let's just jump right in. I know there's always a story behind a book. So I'm going to start with you, John, since you focus on the Old Testament. Why write this book? What makes it unique?
Yeah, great question. So I'd have to say we wrote this book out of having surveyed the current popular literature, the How We Got the Bible kind of titles that you can think of. My folks like say Neil Lightfoot, or maybe Why We Can Trust the Bible by Greg Gilbert, these sorts of works. But I think, Peter and I are friends. We're colleagues at Phoenix Seminary. We direct this Text and Canon Institute. Maybe we'll talk more about it. We just kind of thought maybe it's time to have a dual authored book that really comes out of our different expertises, So often books like this, it's one author trying to cover a whole lot of areas, and it's difficult to cover all that terrain, especially if you're not familiar with it. So between the two of us, we were able to cover quite a bit of that terrain of certain elements of how we got the Bible. So anyways, that's what I would say.
Well, you cover the terrain well, and we're going to get into some of that. Peter, anything you'd add that makes this book unique, or what motivated you to write it?
Maybe just one thing we'd add is that the material in the book we had presented at churches for several years before we wrote it, and so that gave us a chance to field test it, and that's really kind of what pushed us to say, hey, I think we ought to put this in a book form. We felt like one, we had something to contribute in that we could cover both testaments pretty well, like John said, but then also we found that people who love the Bible often don't know how we got it. They really don't. And so we were repeatedly surprised in these conferences we would do by how much people don't know they don't know
right
about the Bible.
That's a great way to put it. Well, the subtitle, The Amazing Story of How We Got the Bible, it really is an amazing story. But what I love is you guys also tackle some of the tough apologetic questions that come up while we talk about how the Bible was put together. So let me ask just a broad one and get your response. There is an unending list of claims that there's a big scandal or conspiracy behind the making of the Bible. John, what are your thoughts when you hear some Time magazine come out and talk about some conspiracy and some new manuscripts that they discovered? Is there any reason to believe there's a scandal or conspiracy behind the making of the scriptures?
Sean, I'm usually excited when I see those because it usually means Christmas is right around the corner. So, but no. To get to your question, it always makes me cringe because anytime Time Magazine, Newsweek, New York Times, what have you, is going to start to sensationalize a particular story or angle of the story of how we got the Bible, I'm just cognizant of the numerous times that has happened. Oftentimes it's bunk. It's not really based on history at all. I'm sure you've covered Dan Brown and the DaVinci Code on here many, many times. We refer to it in the book just a little bit, just to kind of show the kind of scandals and myths and legends that sort of surface in that arena. So I would say Peter and I didn't find any scandal when we surveyed the material once again for this book, but I always cringe, and I always know people are misled by it. I think the last time I looked for the book, Brown's DaVinci Code had over 83 million copies sold.
Oh, gosh.
It's incredible. And
but that's what we're aiming for, Sean. We're aiming for that as well. So.
That's right.
Your listeners can help us out.
So I mentioned that because our book has no chance of that, and that's okay. But that doesn't include the numerous more people that saw the movie, right, with Tom Hanks, right, that came out. And it's fair to say that on Twitter, on Facebook, your next door neighbor, if they have a view about how we got the Bible at all, it's been influenced by Dan Brown one way or another. So that's kind of in some ways that's an extreme example, but I like it because it really, I think, hits most people where they're at. And so obviously there are far more sophisticated, more scholarly views that we have to deal with as well. But I would say your neighbor has been influenced by Dan Brown more than he or she knows. Yeah.
You know, it's amazing we're still talking about the DaVinci Code 2 decades roughly after when it was first released for range reasons. But Peter, these books and these stories sell, right? It almost feels like Indiana Jones. Everyone wants to be an archaeologist, but the work of archaeology and the work of textual criticism is much more sitting in a library, laborious, not dramatic, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, this is it's true. We tend not to go in caves as often as Indiana Jones did. But you know, one of the exciting things about working in this field is we do get new material to work with. And so just a quick story for your listeners. Just yesterday I'm here in North Carolina, actually. I'm not in Phoenix with John, but I was over at Duke's library, and they've got a papyrus published only 4 years ago. That's a 6th century copy of Acts. It's a pretty curious one, actually. I won't go into all the details, but you know, before 2018, we didn't have access to that. And now we have a new 6th century papyrus to think about and to study. So, and that happens sometimes every year, every couple of years, every 3 years that we get something like this. Some new papyrus is published, at least on the New Testament side of things. But even on the Old Testament side, you have things like the Cairo Geniza that's still being studied, and there's just a tremendous amount of material to work with. And John and I like to say the cool thing about the history of the Bible is it's a history of a material artifact, a material thing, right? Because it's written down. We're talking about a book, right? It's been in different formats, different languages, but it's a physical thing, and you can there's just so much to study around it.
Let's get into some of the common objections that we hear. And as we look at them, this will help us understand the larger story of how the Bible is put together. And we'll go back and forth between the Old and the New Testament to keep this conversation going. Let's jump into some of the particulars and the questions about the Old Testament reliability that'll help tell the story of how the Bible is put together. John, as an apologist, I've heard sometimes that there was not even an alphabet during the time of Moses, so he couldn't have written the first 5 books of the Bible. Is that true?
No, there's no way that's true. And it doesn't matter when you date Moses either. If, there's a good debate about when Moses would have lived, when the Exodus happened, either in the 1400s or the 1200s. The earliest evidence for the alphabet comes from a place in Egypt known as Wadi El Hol, and it dates to the 19th century or the 1800s. What was fascinating, though, is even as I'm writing up this section of the book, there was another scholarly article published on with new evidence of the alphabet and what we call linear script from Syria, modern-day Syria, and dated to the late third millennium BC. That would predate the established evidence of scholars by 3 or 4 centuries. So this field is super exciting. I'm not an expert, honestly, in all things ancient alphabets. I probably armchair this, but I've done a ton of reading. It's an amazing field that just continues to yield all kinds of insights. Just yesterday, people were, putting up Canaanite inscriptions, new texts, written in so-called Canaanite script. It's unbelievable the way what archaeologists are pulling out of the dirt when it comes to the history and development of writing. So Moses would have had an alphabet. I'm very convinced of this. In fact, it's interesting. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily coincidental even that much of the evidence for the early alphabet comes out of Egypt. Okay. We don't have to go into crazy areas that Moses or the Israelites invented it or something like that. But providentially, there is an alphabet, and there is a system of writing, and there's even developing scribal culture in the alphabet. I would say by what we call the late Bronze Age, so just before 1200 BC. There's not just an alphabet, but there's actually signs that people are learning to read. People are learning to write.
Wow.
Now, I know evangelicals, but evangelicals have blown out of proportion sometimes, high literacy rates and these sorts of things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying that there's some evidence for learning to read, not just reading and writing, but learning to read and write by the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, so just below 1200 BC on that.
That's great. Now, of course, that doesn't prove Moses wrote it, but it removes a
Of
common
course not.
objection that we've heard over time.
Correct. Historically, we could account for it. Yes.
Gotcha. Now, I'm going to ask you a couple more questions about scribes, and then we're going to come to New Testament scribes with you, Peter, in a moment. But tell us about the earliest scribes of the Old Testament. And I'm asking for context because a lot of our Bibles today are based on the Masoretic text, 9th century AD at the earliest. What do we know about the earliest scribes, either the period of the Dead Sea Scrolls, going back BC a couple centuries, or what you kind of call this middle period, 3rd century to the 8th century AD?
Yes, that's right. So you're right to say, Sean, that the Masoretic period may begin at earliest the 9th century AD. These are Jewish families that received a text and preserved it. Okay, they also innovated it in certain ways too. So one thing that's important to know, that ancient Semitic writing in general did not incorporate vowels. Okay, so highly consonantal texts. Now there were some consonants that functioned as vowels, things like that. But the Masoretes did innovate even as they preserved by incorporating those vowel signs. But okay, so what did the text look like before the Masoretes then? How well can we say they copied it? Well, we actually have a full copy of Isaiah from Qumran, right, amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's the only full manuscript that we have, okay, of a book, I should say. And when you compare that with later manuscripts, what we find is that for over 1,000 years, the book of Isaiah was copied extremely well, okay, and well preserved, well conserved. But there are some other issues now as scholars have continued to find more manuscripts, kind of through the decades. I guess I should say this: the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. So we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls this year, which is exciting. But I also mention that for your listeners so that they know it's not like we've been studying these for that long. 75 years of scholarship is actually a drop in the bucket, okay, in a lot of ways. And so 75 years they've been discovered. The last edition of them was not made available to scholars generally until about 10, 15 years ago. Okay,
Wow.
so we've simply not been or studying and analyzing these scrolls for that long. With all that said, the scribes of that period show two tendencies, and we talk about this in the book. They show a tendency to conservatively copy the text, that is, letter for letter, okay? And we can show in numerous examples that certain books were copied this way. In fact, probably all books were copied this way. It's just that we don't have evidence for every single book, okay, coming out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And by the way, maybe I should mention this too. Qumran is the major place when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there were other sites, places like the fortress at Masada, places like Nahal Hever, or the Cave of Horrors, right? Okay. There were other caves and along the Dead Sea as well that yielded manuscripts. So on the whole, manuscripts copied conservatively, but the Dead Sea Scrolls also showed that there were tendencies to freely copy the text in a sense where maybe the scribe was trying to update the language, or maybe some words had fallen out of use and we didn't know what they meant. English speakers know this. When you turn to your King James Version, you don't know all the vocabulary from 1611. You just don't. And so language is updated. Well, scribes, Hebrew scribes, may also do the same thing. Okay. And so even amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see a popularizing of the text. And the scribe doesn't tell us why he did that. Like that's one of the biggest mysteries to scholars right now, is why do we have different and sort of many forms of the text? Okay. We've got this conservatively copied stream, but we've also got this freely copied, which looks like an updated copy of the same book. And scholars are still trying to sort out for what purpose. So maybe some copies we find were for liturgical reasons, right? Like synagogal worship service type copies. You know what I mean? Some copies definitely show an early kind of commentary writing. Okay, like they're more expansive. They're more explanatory type translation or copies. I shouldn't call them translations at this point, but copies, you know, that may show like an exegetical kind of purpose. All right. So the question is that were the Qumran scribes thinking that they were writing a different Bible or copying a strange Bible? I don't think so. I just when I look at the evidence on the whole, I see two different scribal models that were not competing against each other, rather two models that were complementary. Okay. And so there was a need for that conservatively copied text, almost like our NASB kind of English translation, alongside of a more interpretive or paraphrastic translation, something like the Message, if I can use that as an example, where the Message is far more comprehensible, right, to someone who doesn't know the Bible than, say, the NASB. So I think early Jewish scribes worked along two lines. In fact, scholars have shown, Sean, that sometimes the same scribe is responsible for the two different modes. Yes, that's very interesting. And so we can actually start to make conclusions like that. So still, the jury's still out. Why all the copies, or the different kinds of copies we have, but two different modes working in harmony with each other, not as competing or something like that, I think is the best way to put the evidence together so far. Now, one quick comment, and then I'll let Peter go on the New Testament. It's that period from the 3rd century AD to the Masoretes, right, in the 9th century. This is sometimes known as the Dark Ages of Hebrew Bible copying. There are only a handful of fragments of the Hebrew text possessed or known, okay, from that period. And so that's a major hole in our knowledge of how the text was copied. We have indirect statements, you know, in rabbinic works, you know, like the Talmud and things, but we don't have a lot of direct evidence of what the text looked like and how it was being copied from the end of our Dead Sea Scroll era, so let's say 2nd, 3rd century AD, up to the period of the Masoretes in the 9th century.
That's super helpful. Now, in a minute, I'm going to come back to you with two questions. Number one, how we should then trust the scriptures, given that there's different traditions of 1 Samuel 16 through 18 and Jeremiah. And we're going to get into the differences in the height of Goliath. Fascinates me. I can't wait for that. But let's shift up to the New Testament. Peter, what do we know about some of the earliest scribes of the New Testament, how they compare with maybe later scribes? And in particular, Bart Ehrman has said that our earliest manuscripts have more mistakes and differences than later ones. Is that really accurate?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd start with that second claim first. And statistically speaking, that's just not the case. For a very simple reason that we have far more late manuscripts than we have early manuscripts. So if you were to draw in the book, we show a little bit of a timeline. There's a huge peak in the Middle Ages of copying. And that's because Christianity is the dominant religion in the East, and you've got monasteries all over the place in the Greek-speaking eastern side of the empire. And they need copies for churches and their own their own study of the scriptures in the monastery. So you get this huge explosion of manuscripts in the Middle Ages. Now, overall, I think what Bart is right about is, in general, those later scribes were more careful, and the text tends to coalesce around one particular type of text, what we call the Byzantine text. Okay, so it begins to dominate. But those later scribes would have to be downright amazing to have fewer variants in the later manuscripts than we have in the early manuscripts, because it's simple math. When you have fewer manuscripts in the first period, you're going to have overall a smaller number of variants. Yeah. Now, I think probably what Bart is thinking of is that what most scholars, I think, are thinking, when they say that, is that most of our most interesting variants and most of the ones that we still argue about are already apparent in our early manuscripts. Does that make sense? In other words, there are variants that only show up in the Middle Ages, but they tend to be in one manuscript or two manuscripts. Like, they're just clearly scribal mistakes, so nobody really pays much attention to them. Whereas the kind of variants that we all, as New Testament scholars, still argue about, or that get discussed in commentaries, those ones tend to show up early. Yeah, which frankly is the reason why we still argue about them, because they are early.
That makes sense. So it seems like you're saying there's this movement towards more precision and care in copying. Does that follow that the earliest scribes were therefore careless?
Right. And no. And here, Sean, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to give you a basketball analogy. All right.
Oh, perfect. Now you're talking.
All of us on this video know who the greatest basketball player of all time is. His initials are M and J. Yes? John, are we agreed on this?
Amen.
Do we need...
Amen.
Okay. All right. So we all know Michael Jordan's the best basketball player, and LeBron James is not as good. He's just not. Okay. But that does not mean that LeBron James is a bad basketball player. The fact that LeBron James is worse than Michael Jordan does not make LeBron James a bad basketball player. In the same way, the fact that our earliest manuscripts, even if they are by some measure not as good, not as careful as our later manuscripts, it does not follow from that they are bad. Okay. What we actually find in the early manuscripts is we find both. We find some manuscripts that are not as careful. A manuscript like P72 is one of our earliest copies of, say, 1 Peter. And overall, its text is not as good as a later manuscript like Codex Vaticanus from 100 or so years later. Okay. At the same time, you have a manuscript like P75 from the same period as P72. Okay, P75, very good manuscript. Matches very, very closely to that same 4th century manuscript, Codex Vaticanus, where they overlap in Luke's gospel. So I think it's just, you can't actually make a blanket statement. The earlier scribes are X. What we actually have is we have some very good, some of our earliest manuscripts appear to be very, very good, and some are not as good. Overall, though, I would say almost all of our manuscripts are really good. They're maybe not all Michael Jordans, okay? They're maybe not even all LeBron Jameses, okay? But they all could play in the NBA, let's put it that way. All right. With a few exceptions. I always like to say there's a few exceptions. Codex Beza is a 5th century manuscript of the Gospels and Acts. It's a weird manuscript. But it's the reason why we can identify it as weird, Sean, is because we have so many other manuscripts that look different than it does. Does that make sense? In other words, when you put it against the bigger crowd, it still stands out with having the orange hair. Let's say, do you know what I mean? Like, if everybody's got dark hair, and then all of a sudden one guy's got orange hair, you're like, well, that guy stands out for some reason. Codex Beza is a little bit like that. Okay, but it's not typical.
So Codex Beza is the Dennis Rodman, to stick with the basketball analogy.
That's a perfect analogy. Man, I'm going to steal that. Thank you, Sean. Yeah. You might want him on your team sometimes because the guy can rebound. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, he can.
There's times where Codex Beza has the original reading, and it's 5th century, so that's significant, right? But, man, you don't want him as your spokesman.
Gotcha. Fair. Okay, we're going to come back to some of the variants and what they mean, and give us an example of how textual critics in the New Testament judge between different readings. But John, I've been waiting to ask you this question. Probably 10 years ago, I was at the Evangelical Theological Society, heard a presentation about the height of Goliath, and was stunned that there's reason to think he's not 9 feet tall, biblically and extra biblically. Explain what some of that debate is, but maybe what follows from it for what confidence we can have in the Old Testament.
Right. Well, let me actually just start there. Kind because I love this example because it illustrates a lot of about how variants work and how differences maybe arise. But no one's theology is going to be shaken down to its foundations or core based on this example, right? So let's start there. Okay, this is the height of Goliath we're talking about, not the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay, so I want to be clear about that. Okay, but even saying that, right, I do think this is an interesting variant. It does shape the way in which we read this story. Okay, because we in our children's ministry curricula, right, we always envision David like down here, and and Goliath is like way up here, like 9 foot 9 inches. Okay, but the fact of the matter is there's a Dead Sea Scroll, 4Q Samuel A. Many manuscripts in the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible tradition, that have Goliath at 4 cubits and a span, which puts him at 6 feet 9 inches. Okay, and but then there's the Masoretic manuscripts that we referenced earlier, and a number of translations that follow them, Greek and Latin and Syriac, all have Goliath at that 9 foot 9 inches. Okay, so what text critics do with a problem like this is they try to figure out, first of all, is it an accidental mistake of the scribe? Is there a way that we could determine the original text between 6 and 4 cubits? Okay, and so one scholar, Frank Moore Cross, many years ago, he suggested, well, it's possible maybe that we could show the 4 cubits as original, because the scribe's eye would have skipped down several lines to the description of Goliath's spear, which is described as weighing 600 shekels. Okay, and 600 would have looked a lot like 6 cubits, okay, in Hebrew. And so maybe the original reading is 4 cubits, and we can explain the move from 4 to 6 because of an accidental eye skip on the part of the scribe. Problem is, it's a little too far down, so most scholars are not really convinced by this mistake. So moving sort of some of those sort of common scribal mistakes, if that doesn't account for it, then what internally might motivate a scribe to make the change one way or the other? So if we start again with 4 cubits, a shorter Goliath, you could potentially see a scribe wanting to make Goliath taller so that David's victory over Goliath is much greater, right? So this is possible. Or let's work it the other way. Let's say Goliath, the original text he's 9 feet, so 6 cubits tall. Why would a scribe want to introduce a secondary reading making him shorter? Well, we learn earlier in 1 Samuel that Saul is already taller than all of his countrymen. We learn that in 1 Samuel 9, verse 1 and 2. So maybe a scribe wants to bring Saul and this Goliath kind of more eye to eye to further underscore Saul's cowardice, you see, in this narrative. Other features of Goliath is his height is only mentioned once, but he apparently was a boss on the battlefield. So in single combat, obviously he hadn't lost yet. And apparently he had quite a number of notches on his belt. So in Saul's mind, as this narrative plays out, Saul is actually more worried about Goliath's skill in killing people in single combat, okay, on the battlefield, than he is really about his height. So I could see this going a number of ways, but right now I lean towards the taller Goliath as original, and yes, I know, and then a scribe kind of making him shorter to underscore the Saul issue. Okay, but I could see it kind of going each way, and sometimes it depends on what day you ask me. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I feel like entering into the debate on a height of Goliath, but I'm pretty confident I would lose this one since it's not my lane. But I do find it interesting that the brothers of Goliath, he has 4 brothers, 7 feet tall, much more
Yes.
likely somebody's 3 inches shorter
Right.
than
That's
2
right.
feet taller.
That's right. That's
That,
right.
that grabs my
I agree.
attention. But bottom line
should.
is, scholars come across these differences, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Masoretic text, and they look and try to figure out, why is there this difference? But then you also look, so that's extra biblically, so to speak. But then you look
That's
within the text itself and say, what does the story itself give us any hints? And just try to piece together. But the bottom
right.
line, whether he's 6'9" or 9 feet, there are these differences in the Old Testament, but they're not
for sure.
substantial to take away our confidence in the text as a whole. Is that fair?
That's right. That's fair. Yeah. And the fact that we can piece it together, right, based on sound evidence on both sides, come up with very plausible, probable explanations for why one or the other, this shows me we've got a pretty well-preserved text here. Yeah. So.
You know, it's interesting, John, when David goes to fight him, he doesn't say, how can I fight him? He's 9 feet tall. He says, how can I fight him? He has trained since he was a youth, so it's more his training than his height.
He's got the skill.
But
that's right.
Nonetheless.
No, I'm with you. I tend to, I could see it that way for sure.
Can I just jump in on that point really quick, guys? Because I haven't actually thought about this until just now. I've heard John talk about this a bunch, but one of the things it actually illustrates is the way that sometimes it's important for us, and the way text criticism can help us see the way we read the text that's different from the way that they did. In other words, if you read the text closely, and actually Goliath's height is not the thing that's emphasized, but his prowess as a fighter, then the height difference in the manuscripts is not that as big a deal to you. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
Right.
It does.
That's right.
I think I'm losing you guys.
Yeah, no, we got you. That does make sense. That's a great point.
So, everybody's really interested in the height of Goliath, and Sean, I was exactly like you. The first time John told me this, I was like, wait, what? The height of Goliath can't be an issue. Like, it's Goliath. That's my Sunday school class.
Right.
But we are so fixated on the height issue and him being a giant that maybe that's actually led us to miss something that's more important in the details of the story as we have it, So one of the reasons why I know both John and I appreciate textual criticism as a discipline and telling people about it is because it helps us read our Bible more closely.
Right? Amen.
So that's sort of like, I know it's not an apologetic point per se, but I think that's really important for people to know.
For sure. No, that's right.
That's super important. On that note, let's shift back to the New Testament. Then I've got some more questions for you, John, about how the Bible was put together, how we have the right books. But one of the comparisons that's often made, and my father and I have made this comparison in evidence, is kind of manuscript quantity of the New Testament compared to the second highest ancient book would be Homer. You say a better comparison is specifically the Gospel of Matthew with the Gospel of Thomas. Why do you think that's a better comparison, and what do we find when we compare the two?
Yeah, I like to compare those two because they're both sort of in the same genre. They both have the title gospel. Now, Thomas is obviously a very different type of gospel. It's a sayings gospel, not a narrative. But it's also close in time. It's within a century, whereas Homer is long before Matthew's writing. So in some ways that feels a little bit less fair to me, although he is a very popular ancient. That's a very popular ancient work. So, but Thomas is also a helpful comparison because people have rediscovered it in our own day, and it gets a lot of sensational attention. So, but with Matthew, you have, something like 2,000 copies just in Greek that we can work from. Whereas Thomas, we know that the Gospel of Thomas is written in Greek because we have 3 fragments of it in Greek. They're all fragments, very fragmentary. The only complete copy we have of the Gospel of Thomas is in Coptic, which is a translation. And so what I think that shows is that people are willing to say, well, I think the Gospel of Thomas, if they're not willing to doubt the Gospel of Thomas on its textual grounds, which actually I don't think they should do, frankly, that they certainly should not doubt the Gospel of Matthew, right?
Wow.
I actually think, we have one complete copy of Thomas, and scholars debate whether there's some places where either through translation or miscopying it may be corrupted, but there's probably not that many of those either. And it just goes to show you can have one copy in translation of an ancient work and people still use it to do historical work.
Mm.
Right?
Right.
How
That's
much
so
more
good.
did we be able to do that for the Gospel of Matthew? Now, to be fair, the fact that we have so many copies of Matthew actually does create a lot more work for us. Because there's whole sections of
Mm.
Thomas where we don't have any text critical work to do at all. Because
Right.
we've only got one manuscript, right? We're just looking at it and going, does it make sense? Okay, then we just assume it's right and we move on. Whereas with Matthew, we've got so many manuscripts that if you use a large enough database, you're going to have decisions to make in every verse. Most of them are very easy, and they don't make it to the attention of most people because they don't need to. But do you see the point? The point is
Yep.
the number of manuscripts of the New Testament is what we call a blessing and a curse, but it is also in some ways the solution to its own problem, because it gives us so much material to study, to learn about the kind of mistakes that scribes make, and that makes us better in determining where scribes have actually made a mistake. If I can put it that way.
So if I heard you correctly, Peter, a lot of the copies of Matthew create more challenges and problems, but also helps us better reconstruct the original, and it creates more work, which enables you to have a job.
That's it. That's it.
All right.
I mean,
Job security.
Yeah.
Job security. All right. Let's shift back to the Old Testament. Then I have a specific example I want to come back to for you, Peter. Let's really narrow down. You talked about kind of the careful copying, the conservative copying of the Old Testament manuscripts, but then kind of this free-flowing copying that was in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. So Isaiah matches up almost identically. Brilliant. But Jeremiah and 1 Samuel 16 through 18, of course, which contains a story of David and Goliath, it's not that close. There's a significant variance. So what does that tell us about which text we can trust as a whole?
Yeah. Okay. So let's sort some things out here. Let's start with the David and Goliath problem. So this is basically 1 Samuel 16 to 18. Okay. And what I need to point out, Sean, is that what's interesting is the Dead Sea Scrolls are not what leads scholars to say that there's a big difference between the Masoretic text and, say, another version of the David and Goliath story. The most recent analysis of the David and Goliath story in 4Q Samuel A, okay, that's the fourth cave of Qumran, 1 Samuel document, okay? It's a very fragmentary text, but it actually spans pretty much all of 1 Samuel. And that where it has fragmentary remains from the David and Goliath narrative, it actually agrees with the longer version of the text of the Masoretic text. Okay, what we're talking about too, I should back up. We're talking about 1 Samuel 17 and the second biographical introduction to David. I think it picks up around verse 11 maybe, and it spans like 20 or so verses. Okay, that they're all in our English translations based on the Masoretic text, those verses, but they're not in the Septuagint or the Greek translation of 1 Samuel. That's actually where the difference occurs. Where we have Dead Sea Scroll evidence, it actually agrees with the Masoretic text. Okay, so so what 4Q Samuel A has shown, and more recent analysis of that manuscript has shown, is that the MT longer reading is much older than we initially thought.
Wow.
See, this is why we must be careful, right? Before we go off making major claims, okay? So as the dust starts to settle, better analysis kicks in. We actually find at Qumran, they had the longer version of the David and Goliath narrative. Now, so the big difference then is really between all extant Hebrew manuscripts and the Septuagint, or the Greek translation. And this is maybe a bit new because Peter, I'm sure, and most New Testament scholars, they study ancient translations, but they don't use them for textual criticism as much as Old Testament text critics do. So
I felt a slight coming on there.
Was there a little?
There's a little edge to that comment, folks. Like, I don't know if all our listeners caught it, but it was there. Go ahead. Proceed.
Okay. Yeah. I don't want to make it sound like they don't, but they revel in all these early and many manuscripts, in Greek, and I'm jealous. Frankly, I'm jealous.
We're blessed.
All right. Yeah, very much. All right. But Old Testament text critics, for a very, very long time, centuries into the discipline, have used the Greek translation of the Old Testament as a major source. Okay. And what's interesting, when you look at the way in which First Samuel was translated, okay, from Hebrew into Greek, so this is well before the time of Jesus that this happened. What you actually find is that the translator doesn't omit text. In fact, the translator is more given to an NIV-ish type tendency. And what I mean by that is he's not slavishly following his source, but rather he's actually introducing some things. So let me give you an example. Remember that part in the David and Goliath encounter where Goliath says, am I a dog that you come out to me with a stick, and this sort of thing. And I think basically, the MT or our English translation has something like, well, no, but the Greek translator adds, no, rather you're worse than a dog. And he gets really salty with Goliath on the battlefield, in the Greek version. So what that actually shows, though, is that the translator is given to slightly expanding his text, never reducing it, you see. So what this has shown scholars is that the Greek translator must have had a shorter Hebrew copy in front of him that had already reduced the text. It had already omitted the second biographical introduction to David in chapter 17, because David, right, is also properly introduced in chapter 16, you see. So perhaps a scribe worked in a reducing capacity, and that's the copy that the Greek translator had in front of him. But again, you see I'm using the word perhaps, probably, plausibly. This is tough because, again, with 4Q Samuel A, the translator wouldn't have had that text in front of him. Okay, so in other words, there's no Hebrew evidence for what I'm saying. All we have is the Greek translation and the 10. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yep.
And we've been able to describe the tendencies of that translator. So that's what puts together a plausibility case. But this is tough. So that's one. Oh, yeah.
Oh, so let me ask you this.
Yeah, go ahead.
When we look at some of the differences between the Septuagint and, say, the Masoretic text, are these kind of substantive differences between the Gospel of Thomas, where all of a sudden there's this errant theological teaching that a woman is saved by becoming a male, or are they just the kind of details that expand the story but are faithful to the text itself?
Yeah, right. No, I think they're mainly faithful to the text itself. Now, there are differences, and what's fascinating, your readers need to know this too, because the Old Testament issues, they are bigger. Okay, it's not just, we can't just put them in a nice box. Maybe I'm being salty here myself. It's not a John 8, Mark 16. Okay, let's get the big ones in a box, and we've got it. There's Origen of Alexandria, the church father, when he did his detailed comparison of the Greek copies of the Old Testament with the Hebrew copies in the late 2nd, early 3rd century AD, when he did that, when he got to the tabernacle building in Exodus 35 to 40, I mean, Sean, he notes this in his letter to Africanus. He says, it looks like there's two minds behind these. Not because the material was different, but it had been rearranged. One or the other had rearranged the material. Does that make sense? So things occurred in a different order. And so Origen, looking at this sort of stark difference, he wonders whether there's sort of two designs or two minds behind it. What I like this example because it does show us that we're not modern scholars discovering these problems for the first time. Christians have known about these problems for a very, very long time. Okay. And notice, right, the faith is still here. Okay. Now this hasn't rocked the faith down to its core. It hasn't, but rather it has created a faith seeking understanding. Text critics need to continue to slowly and methodically work through these problems. And, I think more and more light is being cast on a tabernacle type issue. But that's a place where the Septuagint and the Hebrew copies really do disagree with each other. And it even looks like maybe two different accounts, okay? Even though a tabernacle is built, the glory of Yahweh descends upon it and fills it. You know, priests are unable to carry out their responsibilities, right, while that happens. Like, all of that's the same. But there's a different ordering of the material there. I'm trying to think of some other examples.
I
Of
think
this
that's
sort of thing.
I think that's great. That makes the point that we're looking for. That there are some questions that remain. Old Testament
Yeah.
scholars also have job security, but the more we discover, it seems like you're saying we do have confidence and we're finding plausible solutions to these
I think so.
rather than the problems or unsolved issues creating more problems. I think is how you stated it.
For sure.
Okay.
We've only known about the Dead Sea Scrolls for 75 years. That's astonishing. Like, we need to be patient. We need to be, faithful in our work. Yeah.
Let me shift to you, Peter. There's a ton of debate and discussions about how many variants there actually are and what significance they have. So, two-part question. Let's just stick with the Greek manuscripts. What's your best estimate of how many variants they are, and why is that significant? And then maybe, I guess this is a three-part question, maybe unpack the example you give in Mark 1:2, where there's a citation, obviously, from the Old Testament referencing the coming of Jesus and John the Baptist's foreshadowing, how textual critics determine which reading is most likely accurate.
Yeah, good. All right, so that's a couple of questions. So, simple answer to the how many variants there are. The best estimate, and I'm biased because it's my own estimate,
Sure.
is that there are about 500,000 non-spelling differences in our Greek manuscripts. Okay, so that does not include spelling differences. It is an estimate. Why is it an estimate? Because I told you earlier we have a lot of manuscripts. Nobody has gone through all 2,000 so manuscripts of Matthew's gospel and compared them at every point. Why? Because it's extremely tedious to do that, and frankly, there probably isn't that much that we would gain from doing it. Okay. Eventually we probably will, because we like to do things to the nth degree as text critics. But for now, we can live without that. But so it's an estimate based on those places in the New Testament where we do have really robust data to work from on the number of variants and where all the manuscripts, say, of John 18 or the book of Philemon, for example, have been compared to each other. All right. Once you have that number, that's a huge number, about 500,000. That's a lot. Okay. But then you have to ask yourself the question, how many of them matter and who do they matter for? Okay. And so you can take something like John 18, where again, we have this really robust data to work from. And if you look at your, let's start with commentaries. If you take some technical commentaries, you'll probably find them discussing 5, maybe 6 variants in that whole chapter. Okay. So out of thousands of variants that they could discuss if they wanted to, which they don't want to, they discuss about 5, okay, 5 or 6. By the time you get to an English translation, which is trying to present, the variants that really affect English translation, I don't know of a single English translation that has a footnote about a variant in John 18. In other words, the translators are that confident that they can either dismiss the variants or resolve them, that none of them rise to the level where they say this affects translation and it's a difficult problem we need to alert the reader to. None. Okay. Wow. Now that's John 18. Not every chapter is the exact same in the New Testament, as you can imagine. But I do think that gives you a sense. You could probably think these sorts of percentages are always a bit tricky to work with. But the Greek New Testament that is designed for Bible translators, okay, I would say about 1% of the text based on that edition involves variation that could affect translation, and where the decision may be somewhat difficult, although even there, the difficulty of decisions ranges. Okay, so I find that probably per New Testament book, again, it depends somewhat on the book, but you can think there are maybe 3 to 4 pretty significant variants in Matthew.
Okay.
Now again, it depends on who you are, whether they're significant or not. I'm writing a commentary on Jude and 2 Peter right now, and it's a commentary that's mainly designed for a wider audience. I'm not going to discuss near as many variants in that as I would, say, in a technical commentary. or that
Makes
I might
sense.
push my students at the seminary to go through. But it's still going to be more than I would discuss if I were, say, preaching it or teaching it. And it's not because I'm trying to hide it from people. It's just because they don't rise to that level of importance to the meaning of the text, right? They're
Yep.
usually smaller matters that you have to be doing pretty detailed work before they matter. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
And they
Yeah.
don't affect the meaning of the text. I'll give you let's do the Mark. We can do the Mark 1 example. Okay, that's maybe a good example. This is a bit of a tricky one. Most of our Bible translations say, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, and then introduce a quotation that seems to be a combination of, yes, Isaiah 40, but then also something from either Exodus 23 or Malachi 3. Okay? And so we have a variant in the manuscripts, which is not terribly surprising, where some manuscripts, instead of saying, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, have, as is written in the prophets.
Mm.
Okay? And so we have to wrestle with this. Which one of these readings explains how the other one came about? Okay? And one argument is to say, well, if prophets is original, then some scribes wanted to be more specific. Okay, so they clarify the text by naming the most famous prophet of their options they had there. And Isaiah is certainly more famous now. I suppose you could say Moses, but it's not the clearest citation of Exodus 23 there. So you could see them pointing to Isaiah 40. Also, Isaiah 40 is the one that's quoted in the other synoptic gospels, right? For this, to make this exact same point, to anticipate the coming of John the Baptist. Okay. On the other side, you could say, well, no, Isaiah is original, and scribes were a little bit troubled that they recognized that other texts besides just Isaiah were quoted here, and so they just changed it to the plural prophets to sort of smooth out a potential problem in the text. I think that explanation is more likely for two reasons. One, I think scribes tended to make the text easier rather than more complicated.
Mm.
And in general. And then the second reason is the reading in Isaiah the prophet is found in our earliest and, in my opinion, our best manuscripts as well.
Mm.
So in my opinion, there are two arguments in favor of Isaiah being original. One, it's what we call the more difficult reading, slightly more difficult. And then the second is that it's found in the better manuscripts. So that's the type. Now, some people would read that and say, oh, well, if it says on Isaiah the prophet, that's wrong then. It's not wrong. It's an indication of the way they cited scripture at this time. Isaiah is by far the most prominent of the people Mark quotes here. Isaiah's theology is hugely important in Mark's gospel, if you read it carefully and know Isaiah well. And so actually it makes perfect sense with Mark's own theology that he would want to highlight Isaiah in particular as the one who writes about the coming of the Son of Man, right? So that's just an example of the way we kind of work through these problems on the New Testament side of things.
I want to narrate for our viewers here that we've looked at two examples. One from the Old Testament, Height of Goliath, which is super interesting, but nothing theologically or biblically significant rests upon that difference. No. And same with this intro in Mark, whether it's prophet, prophets, Isaiah, Malachi, Exodus. These are important nuances, but we can't miss the forest, so to speak, for the trees. And this is often what happens. So to say that there's, amidst some of these variants, less than 1% of them are significant in terms of what the meaning is, and even that meaning isn't something essential, is really, really important to keep in mind. Now, we're running somewhat short on time, but maybe I'll shift back to you, John. Maybe we'll do a full show on this at some point. But one thing we often hear is that it was just kind of a conspiracy and accidental about the books that we have in the Bible. I realize the Old Testament and the New Testament are different questions. How do we have confidence, kind of just a quick, give us a summary of how you approach this in your book when it comes to the Old Testament books?
Yeah, so the Old Testament, the way we cover it in the book is there are three formative periods that bring us our Old Testament. Okay, there's what I like to call kind of the pre-New Testament, pre-Jesus period. Okay, what can we learn from these Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, the New Testament documents themselves about what books the Jews thought were the oracles of God, right? The divinely inspired books. Okay, well, newsflash. I mean, except for a quotation in what's known as the Damascus document of Jubilees, okay, or at least a reference to Jubilees. Pretty much Qumran writings only quote books that are in our Old Testament or in the Jewish Tanakh, Okay, so it's interesting. Not all the books are quoted. I think that's where scholars try to find more wiggle room, And just Philo of Alexandria, same thing. He actually just quotes the Pentateuch, Moses' first 5 books, like a lot. But he does make reference to Jeremiah and other prophetic books as well. We're going to be more familiar with how the New Testament quotes these books, just like Peter referred to earlier. So the question is, though, is like, what do you do with a book like Esther? What do you do with a book like Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, books that are nowhere quoted in this earliest period? And yet, by the time you get to around 100 AD, the Jewish historian Josephus is talking about how the Jews have only ever had, or at least for a long time have had 22 books, okay, that they can look to. And again, how we go through this in the book, how did Jews and Christians number books and that sort of thing. I won't get bogged down on this, but basically after that, after Josephus, who I think is a major milestone, really, after that, though, you in the Christian period, you get early canon lists, or I like to just call them early tables of contents for the Bible. Okay, and these are the clearest statements of what a Christian writer or regional synod or council thought was in the Old Testament. Okay, what I expected to find there, Sean, was the Roman Catholic canon throughout. I expected to find all of the what they call the deuterocanonical books, what we sometimes call the Apocrypha. I expected that those lists would include those books. I was surprised that of the 12 early Greek Christian lists, none of those books are listed as amongst the canon, okay,
wow,
or the
that's
canonical books. That is very interesting. In fact, several Latin lists don't contain them either. The list by Jerome, Hilary, Rufinus of Aquileia, they do not include these books. Now, our favorite theological homeboy, though, like Augustine, he does include them, okay, and he and they're not separated out or anything. They're fully integrated amongst his canonical Old Testament books. We work through this, we sort through this, but
yeah.
I there's a way to get there. But we also, I want to just make one last statement here, because I know we're running short on time. In the Reformation period, we do discuss the Old Testament canon there, because it comes to a head at the Council of Trent. But there's a fascinating prehistory, even just a few decades or so before. We tend to think, well, Martin Luther wouldn't have accepted this wider canon. He would not have accepted the book of Tobit as canonical or something like this, which is true. What we would not have expected to find, though, is that, say, a Catholic scholar like Erasmus, he also didn't consider Tobit to be canonical, you see. Or who was the other one we talked about, Peter? Oh, Cardinal Cajetan. Yeah, Cardinal Cajetan, who he's the one responsible for reviewing Martin Luther's doctrine at the Diet of Augsburg in 1518. Wow. Yeah, but Cardinal Cajetan, when he comes to the end of his commentary on the historical books of the Old Testament, he makes it super clear as to why he's not writing a commentary on 1st and 2nd Maccabees, because they're not part of the Old Testament, he says. They're history, yes, but they're not part of the Old Testament. And he goes on to explain why, in a way that Martin Luther, I think, would have agreed with, you see. And then he also talks about, the books of like Tobit and Judith and Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus in the Latin tradition, what we might call Ben Sira, okay? Those books for Catholic Cardinal Cajetan are not in his canon, you see. I think that's fascinating. And those statements are in the 1530s, 10 years before the Council of Trent. Okay, so when Trent decided, and again, we found all kinds of fun stuff when we delved into Trent for this book, because it turns out, it turns out there was a lot of different opinion even at Trent. So anyhow, but the decree is history.
Let me ask you a question. I feel like there's probably an obvious answer to this, and I'm just missing something. But when you talked about canonization of the Old Testament, I don't believe you brought in the Septuagint. If that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament available in the New Testament day, don't we have confidence about what the Old Testament was by the 1st century?
Well, kind of. There's a misnomer out there, Sean. We should never talk about a Septuagint canon. Okay. No. Septuagint, that anglicized Latin word for Septuaginta, meaning 70. Okay, we've actually invented the term Septuagint. But Septuaginta would only refer to the translation of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay, properly speaking. Eventually, it was a term that was adopted to try to encompass the entire Old Testament or something like this, and eventually it's meant to encompass those extra books, not part of the Hebrew canon, but it was part. But those deuterocanonical books were part of the Septuagint canon. In fact, this one right here. This includes the Enoch fragments as part of the Septuagint. No. So
you stepped on a landmine here, Sean.
I'm okay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Sean's like, what did I just do? But I guess my point is that all those early Christian canon lists that I referred to earlier, most of them actually refer to the Hebrew canon. They actually say the church has 22 books, just as there are 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, right? Just as we know the Jews in their synagogue are reading. Okay? I think that's astonishing, and that's a part of this history that not many Christians know about. And so when the Protestants, just to fast forward way ahead again, they basically say, no, our canon should mirror the Hebrew canon. They're not just sort of spitballing this. Like, there's a massive tradition behind them. Not just Jerome, but we could look at Athanasius of Alexandria, Gregory of Nazianzus, Cyril of Jerusalem. All of these fathers compare their 22-book canon to the 22-book canon of the Jews, you see. So it's actually a widespread tradition. In fact, in the book, I mean, I try not to skew it too much, but with Augustine and basically North African churches, you have a different thing going on where they are seeming to expand the canon beyond the Hebrew canon, you see. And so, but in any case, I got to say this in conclusion, the Septuagint plays no role.
Wow.
No role in this history. Nope. None of these fathers ever claim the Septuagint as their authority for the canon that they have. Origen talks about the Greek copies of the church. He hardly ever refers to the 70. Okay, Augustine may refer to the 70, but he's even aware of some problems because he knows that the Maccabean books could not have been translated by those same 70 translators, for example. So he's got a few things to work out in his own chronology, but still, he's not pointing to a Septuagint canon or something like this.
That's super helpful. I tell you, in some ways, I did open a can of worms on this, and there are so many more questions. Maybe we'll come back and do a whole one on canonization. I think would be really helpful down the line. Let's plan on it. But we're pushing time. Let me ask you guys just one last quick question. You probe into the depths in the Old Testament and the New Testament in ways that I don't. How does your scholarship affect your faith? Peter, go for it.
I would say, I've been doing this for, I don't know that old, but I've been doing this for a number of years, Sean. So it's like, for me, these questions are not new. And so I've resolved a lot of the theological questions to my own satisfaction for quite a while now. So at this point in my life, the scholarship that I do, I would say the simplest way to say is that it fires my faith. That I love it. I mean, I study the Bible because I love the Bible. I love the Bible because I'm convinced that it's true. And, there was certainly a period in my life as a student where these kinds of questions raised difficult theological questions for me about, say, inerrancy or inspiration. And I've worked those out. And now I see, I look at a manuscript and I think this is a copy of God's Word. And I feel incredibly thankful that we have it and that I have copies of God's Word. I think it's helpful to remind people. I think sometimes we as modern people think that we kind of approach it the same way we approach morals. okay, I'm going to try to be careful here, Sean, not to get too off on this, but we tend to think that we're sort of the best there's ever been, morally speaking, you know, that history is a straight line of progress and we're up here at the top, right? And we've gotten so much better than everybody who's gone before us. And certainly, I think some of that is because technologically we're so advanced, you know, the fact that I can get on an airplane and fly across the country just makes me think we're better at everything else. Anyways, I think sometimes that tempts us to think that we also ought to have the best Bible there's ever been, and anything less than the quality of the Bible that we have now is somehow not up to par. And I always remind my students when we're studying manuscripts, I think, look, all these manuscripts that, yes, they have scribal mistakes in them, these were people's Bibles. And they were more than good enough. And our Bibles today are built on so much more manuscript information than any Bibles in the past that it just seems to me like, the height of ingratitude to worry almost. I mean, that's putting it a little bit too extreme because we do need to sort through these things. And John's raised some important questions and we all have to work through these. And some of this is me speaking as somebody who's worked through some of them, right? But I do think, when I think about the history of the Bible, my first response to it is not like, oh, thank goodness I can now trust the Bible still. Although it is that. But it's actually more at this point in my life just like, I should be so much more grateful for it than I am.
Wow.
Like, so many people have given their lives in the case of somebody like a William Tyndale in translating, or these scribes did the meticulous work of copying it so that I can have a Bible that I can read and have really good confidence that this is God's word and he's speaking to me. You know, am I going to sit here and complain because I'm not 1,000% sure whether it's in Isaiah the prophet or in the prophets, when the fact is Isaiah did prophesy about this guy hundreds of years before? Like it's like what you said before, let's not miss the forest for the trees.
That's great.
You know, think about what the Bible claims about Jesus. Those are the big things you ought to be wrestling with, not whether Mark 1:2 has plural or plural prophets or singular Isaiah. There's a place for that. I'm not denying that. Again, I'm a text critic. I think about this stuff. I'm happy to. But I think at the end of the day, we have to ask bigger, more important questions like, what does this book say about who Jesus is? What does it say about who I am in relation to God? And frankly, that is not stuff that is in the least bit affected in the ultimate sense by these kinds of questions we're talking about today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great answer.
I'm not trying to say what I do is unimportant, Sean. I'm not.
Oh, we know you want job security. That came across loud and clear.
I think it is important. I just think we ought to make sure we keep it in its place. And let's answer the big questions first, and then think through these questions as well.
Right. That's right. Yeah, good. Yeah, no, something Peter and I talk about quite a bit with church folks is scholarship done from, say, the disposition of faith-seeking understanding, and how that might differ from scholarship done with sort of tabula rasa type approach. Okay. Faith in the sense that we're going to remain doing this work as committed Christians, but we're also committed to understanding. That is, we are committed to going where the evidence goes. Okay. But rather than like despair, as I think some maybe have done in the past when they see, differences with the David and Goliath narrative, or the fact that Greek Jeremiah is shorter than Hebrew Jeremiah and these sorts of problems. I think for what it's done for me is it's expanded my view of God's providence. Like things I've known as a child, knowing the story in Genesis 50 of God's providence over how Joseph gets to Egypt, right? How his brothers and family wind up there, and how God ultimately saves a people through some pretty normal, evil, yes, but pretty normal means is the way God saves this people. And I think if you sort of apply that to the manuscript histories that we see, the canonization process, the translation efforts, we get a great appreciation for the human side of things and just how messy that can be at times and all that. But I also I take one more step back though, and I go, wow, what a mosaic God has created here by the preserving of his word through these diverse means. So anyways, that I feel like as a Christian, I look back and go, well, God's just as much as in control of this as I say he is about everything, So that also should say to us too, as this goes to Peter's larger point, we should be content with what God has preserved for us, and not sort of putting greater or lesser certainties upon that data. So, anyways.
That's a great answer. I definitely want to commend this book to our viewers today. Scribes and Scripture, Christian or skeptic, novice or expert, you'll be encouraged and you'll definitely learn. It's a great book. And we need to do that follow-up show in due time, John, in terms of canonization. And Peter, we'll definitely have you back. Appreciate what both of you do in your writing, your speaking with clarity, your faith. Be encouraged. And those of you watching, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other conversations, some other dialogues, some other videos coming up. And if you've thought about studying textual criticism, check out Phoenix Seminary. Doing a wonderful job there. If you want to study apologetics, check out Biola University. We have the top-rated distance program, and we have full classes on the topic that we discussed today. Fellas, thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it.